I let them call me the bitter old woman. I swallowed every cruel whisper, every rolled eye, and every nasty rumor my daughter-in-law spread about me, all to protect my son's perfect little world. I played the part of the wicked mother-in-law because I knew her sweet smile was hiding something rotten. I kept my mouth firmly shut, waiting in the shadows. But today, standing outside a country club, holding a manila envelope with a set of DNA results, my days of playing the villain are officially over. My name is Beatrice. I am 62 years old, and for 35 years I walked the halls of the largest high school in our district as principal. I commanded auditoriums, shaped thousands of young minds, and never let anyone tell me what I could or could not achieve. But my greatest pride was always my son Jamal. After his father passed away when he was just a toddler, I worked double shifts, clipped coupons, and stretched every dollar until it screamed. I sacrificed my own youth to make sure my boy never felt the sting of absence or poverty. Every late night grading papers and every skipped meal was worth it the day I watched him walk across that stage to accept his medical degree. He was my entire world, and there was nothing I would not do for him, which makes it almost comical that right now I am standing in the sweltering heat of the parking lot outside the Oak Ridge Country Club, listening to the muffled sounds of a party I was explicitly banned from attending. Inside those heavy doors, my son is hosting a lavish baby shower for his wife, Savannah. She is the woman who smiled in my face while systematically cutting me out of my own child's life. Savannah made sure to tell Jamal that the stress of having me around was bad for the baby. She painted me as aggressive, overbearing, and toxic. And Jamal, my brilliant but blinded son, asked me to stay away to keep the peace. So I stayed away. I stood across the street, gripping the leather handle of my purse, watching the valet park luxury cars for her brother Hunter and her sister-in-law Claire, the very people who laughed at my modest house and called me controlling behind my back. They were in there sipping expensive champagne on my son's dime, celebrating a miracle child. But I am not standing out here to beg for an invitation. I am standing here because the envelope I am holding burns right through my hands. I spent months playing the fool, letting Savannah think she had won the war. I let her banish me to the sidelines, while I quietly hired a private investigator to look into the convenient little financial emergencies her family kept having. And just this morning, the final piece of the puzzle arrived in my mailbox. A certified DNA test result pulled from a discarded coffee cup belonging to Savannah's very wealthy ex-boyfriend. I can hear the jazz band playing inside, and I know Savannah is probably opening gifts right now, soaking up the attention. She thinks she has secured her meal ticket for the next 18 years. She thinks she has successfully isolated the wealthy doctor from his protective mother. But as I take a deep breath and start walking toward those country club doors, she is about to learn a very hard lesson. You can call a mother many things, but you should never mistake her silence for weakness. My husband passed away when Jamal was barely walking. The silence he left behind in our small house was heavy, but I did not have the luxury of drowning in my grief. I had a little black boy looking up at me with his father's bright, inquisitive eyes, depending entirely on me to be both his shield and his provider. I was a high school teacher back then, slowly and painfully working my way up the ranks to become principal. Let me tell you, the salary of a public school educator was absolutely nothing to brag about. But I made a solemn vow to my late husband and to God that Jamal would never feel the bitter sting of poverty or the hollow ache of missing out on his dreams. For years, my life was a relentless, exhausting cycle of absolute dedication. After putting Jamal to bed each night, I would sit at our cramped kitchen table until 2 a.m, grading endless stacks of history papers under a dim yellow light. My weekends were never spent resting or socializing. They were spent meticulously clipping coupons from Sunday newspapers, mapping out grocery store sales, and tutoring struggling students just to scrape together a few extra dollars. Every single penny I managed to save went straight into a glass jar, then into a high-yield savings account, and eventually into Jamal's college fund. I happily wore the same frayed winter coat for 12 long years, just so I could afford to buy him the absolute best textbooks and the sharply tailored suits he needed for his medical school interviews. And my sacrifice finally paid off. Watching Jamal walk across that grand stage to receive his medical degree was the proudest, most glorious moment of my entire life. My beautiful son was a doctor. We had survived the struggle, and we had made it to the mountaintop. Shortly after his grueling residency began, Jamal brought Savannah home to meet me. At first glance, she seemed like an answered prayer. Savannah presented herself as a sweet, incredibly supportive woman who completely understood the punishing hours Jamal worked at the hospital. She would bring him carefully prepared lunches, sit with me on my front porch, and listen with wide, attentive eyes to my stories about my decades navigating the education system. She called me a role model. She praised my strength and my resilience. I welcomed her into my heart with wide open arms, truly believing my son had found an equal partner who would cherish him exactly as much as I did. When Jamal finally proposed, I was the one who helped him pick out the perfect diamond ring. I wanted their life together to start on the firmest financial foundation possible. But a young doctor's salary during residency is far from what people assume it is, and Savannah possessed exceedingly expensive tastes. She dreamed of a massive, beautiful suburban home with a wraparound porch and a pristine, manicured lawn. An estate she deemed fitting for a prominent young doctor and his new bride. Jamal was visibly stressed about their finances, losing precious sleep over mortgage loan approvals and interest rates. I could not bear to see my son carrying that heavy burden. Without saying a word to him, I quietly went to my bank and withdrew the vast majority of my hard-earned retirement savings to cover the entire 20% down payment on their dream house. It was a massive sum money I had painstakingly saved for my own golden years, but I told myself it was simply an investment in my family's future happiness. The quiet financial help did not stop there. Savannah soon got her real estate license and swiftly convinced Jamal that she desperately needed to project an image of extreme wealth to attract high-end clients in the suburbs. She claimed driving an average, reliable sedan was costing her lucrative commissions. Jamal was already working exhausting back-to-back hospital shifts, desperately picking up extra hours just to furnish the massive house I had bought them. Seeing his exhaustion, I stepped in once again. I walked straight into a luxury car dealership and bought Savannah a brand new, fully loaded premium SUV. I paid the exorbitant price in full, so my son would not have to take on another agonizing monthly note. Savannah hugged me tight that day in the dealership parking lot, calling me the greatest mother in the entire world. I thought I was securing their peace of mind. I thought I was easing their daily struggles so they could focus entirely on building a loving, solid marriage. I had absolutely no idea I was merely feeding a bottomless, calculated pit of greed. The ink on their marriage certificate was barely dry when Savannah's mask began to slip. The sweet, attentive daughter-in-law vanished, replaced by a woman who viewed my very existence as a threat to her newfound kingdom. The subtle shift started with missed phone calls and suddenly cancelled Sunday dinners. Then came the insidious campaign to paint me as an overbearing, toxic mother-in-law. If I brought over a homemade casserole because I knew Jamal was working a 36-hour shift, Savannah would dramatically sigh and complain to him that I was crossing her boundaries and insulting her ability to care for her own husband. If I called to check on them, I was smothering them. Slowly and methodically, she began twisting my acts of love into acts of malicious control. But the true nightmare began when I was formally introduced to Savannah's core circle, her brother Hunter and his wife Claire. From the moment they stepped into the massive home I had effectively paid for, they acted as Savannah's personal echo chamber. Hunter was a failed contractor who constantly reeked of cheap cologne and unearned arrogance. Claire was a white American woman whose polite smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. At our monthly family dinners, which I was barely invited to anymore, they made it their mission to undermine me right in front of my son. Hunter would lean back in his chair, swirling the expensive scotch my son had bought, and make passive-aggressive jokes at my expense. He would chuckle and say things like, "Jamal, you really need to cut the cord. Buddy, your mother is way too controlling, and it is not healthy for a grown man to have his mommy hovering over his marriage." I would sit across the table, gripping my cloth napkin under the table to hide my shaking hands. Then Claire would chime in, leaning over her plate to deliver loud theatrical whispers designed specifically for me to hear. She would look at my conservative dress and mutter to Savannah that your mother-in-law has such an outdated, aggressive demeanor. And it is a cultural thing, I suppose you are so brave for putting up with her hostility, Savannah. They were gaslighting me in my own son's dining room, using coded language and racial microaggressions to paint me as an angry, difficult black woman who was trying to ruin their perfect suburban dream. And Savannah would play the victim flawlessly, looking down at her plate with fake tears in her eyes, telling Jamal that she was trying so hard to love me, but my presence was just too damaging to her mental health. Jamal, exhausted from saving lives at the hospital and utterly blinded by his love for his wife, would look at me with pleading, tired eyes. "Mum, please, just try to be a little more understanding of Savannah's feelings," he would say. His words felt like a physical blow to my chest. He actually believed their carefully crafted narrative. He believed I was the villain in their story. Any other woman would have stood up, flipped that heavy oak dining table, and demanded every single dime of her money back. But I am a mother first. I saw the dark, heavy bags under my son's eyes. I knew the immense, crushing pressure he was under at the hospital. If I caused a massive scene and exposed his wife and her family for the leeches, they truly were, it would absolutely break him. So I made the most agonizing choice of my life. I swallowed my pride, I bit my tongue, and I willingly accepted the role of the wicked, overbearing mother-in-law. I stepped back, allowing them to push me to the very edges of my son's life, enduring their cruel whispers and relentless disrespect in total silence. I took the blame to protect Jamal's fragile peace. My silent endurance became my daily cross to bear a burden that grew infinitely heavier the day Savannah gathered the family in the living room and tearfully announced her miracle pregnancy. Jamal wept with pure joy, falling to his knees to kiss her stomach. But as I watched Savannah look up over my son's shoulder and shoot a triumphant, chilling smirk directly at Hunter and Claire, my blood ran completely cold. She had secured her ultimate leverage, and I knew with terrifying certainty that her campaign to destroy me was only just beginning. I remember the exact moment the blindfold was finally ripped from my eyes. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Jamal had been working back-to-back shifts at the hospital, running himself ragged just to keep up with the endless demands of his new household. I knew my son. I knew the dark circles under his eyes meant he was skipping meals. So I spent all morning in my small kitchen, preparing his favorite smothered turkey wings and a large pot of collard greens. I packed the warm containers into canvas bags and drove across town to the sprawling suburban estate I had practically bought for them. I used the spare key Jamal had given me, a key I knew Savannah absolutely despised me having. The massive house was completely silent. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh paint, but it felt remarkably cold. I walked into the pristine kitchen with the marble countertops that cost more than my first home. I set the heavy bags of food down by the sink, intending to leave a quick note for my son and slip out before Savannah returned from whatever luxury spa or shopping trip she was on. That was when I saw it. Savannah had left her sleek silver tablet sitting right on the kitchen island. The screen was illuminated. I was never a woman to snoop through other people's affairs, But as I reached for a pen next to the tablet, a message notification flashed across the bright screen. The name Hunter popped up. The preview of the text was what made my blood turn to absolute ice. The message read verbatim that he needed the next transfer by Friday, or the auditors were going to seize his contracting equipment, and that Savannah needed to drain the joint account before Jamal noticed. I froze. My breathing stopped in my chest. For a moment, the only sound in that massive kitchen was the heavy pounding of my own heartbeat. My hands began to tremble, but a fierce maternal instinct took over, pushing my fear aside. I reached out and tapped the glowing notification. Savannah had not locked the device. The messaging application opened to a long, frantic thread between Savannah and her brother Hunter. I scrolled up, reading messages that made me physically sick to my stomach. I saw undeniable proof that for the past 8 months, Savannah and Hunter had been systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from the joint accounts Jamal held. Hunter had completely run his contracting business into the ground through sheer incompetence and massive gambling debts. To keep him afloat and to maintain the wealthy facade they presented to the world, Savannah was draining my son dry. She referred to Jamal in the texts as her clueless personal bank. She told Hunter exactly how she was manipulating the banking passwords and hiding the wire transfers under the guise of home renovations and future nursery expenses. She bragged about how easy it was to distract an exhausted doctor who trusted his wife implicitly. Every single word was a deliberate, calculated stab at the boy I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears. The sheer disrespect and the blatant theft were staggering, but the evil ran much deeper than stolen money. Driven by a sudden, terrifying clarity, I closed the text messages and opened her primary email application. I knew I was crossing a line, but the survival of my son was at stake. I tapped into a folder labeled Personal. There I found a long, encrypted email thread between Savannah and a man named Preston. Preston was Savannah's extremely wealthy ex-boyfriend, the man she had dated right before she miraculously fell in love with my hard-working son. I read the emails with a growing sense of absolute horror. Savannah was demanding money from Preston to keep quiet about their recent encounters. The dates of their secret meetings aligned perfectly with the timeline of her sudden miracle pregnancy. Preston was brushing her off, telling her in cold corporate terms that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with her or the child. Savannah responded with a message that will haunt me until the day I die. She wrote to Preston that he did not need to worry because she had a brilliant doctor husband who would blindly put his name on the birth certificate. She explicitly stated her plan to lock Jamal down permanently with this child. Once the baby was born and Jamal was legally bound, she planned to slowly drain the large trust fund I had established for him and use his high medical income to fund her and Hunter's lavish lifestyles indefinitely. She called my future grandchild her ultimate insurance policy. She had fabricated the entire pregnancy timeline to trap my son into a lifetime of financial servitude. I stood in that silent kitchen, clutching the edge of the marble island to keep my knees from buckling. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash that expensive tablet against the wall. I wanted to call Jamal at the hospital and demand he come home immediately so I could show him exactly who he had married. But the years of teaching and managing high school crises had taught me one vital lesson. Reacting with raw emotion only gives the enemy the upper hand. If I confronted Jamal right then with nothing but a story about snooping through an iPad, Savannah would effortlessly spin the narrative. She would cry. She would play the hormonal pregnant victim. She and Hunter would convince Jamal that the wicked, overbearing mother-in-law had finally lost her mind and fabricated lies out of pure jealousy. They would use my outburst to sever my connection to Jamal completely and permanently. So I did the hardest thing a mother could ever do. I closed the email application. I wiped the screen completely clean of my fingerprints using the hem of my shirt. I placed the tablet down in the exact position I had found it. I unpacked the warm food into the refrigerator, left a cheerful sticky note on the counter telling Jamal to eat a good dinner, and I walked out of that house with my head held high. I got into my car and drove away, holding back my tears, because crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. I went straight into absolute survival mode. The very next morning, I drove across town to a modest, unmarked office building and sat down across from a highly recommended private investigator named Mr. Wallace. I paid his substantial retainer in cash. I gave him every piece of information I had memorized from Savannah's tablet. I gave him Hunter's business details, Preston's full name, and the dates of the illicit wire transfers. Mr. Wallace was a quiet, thorough man who understood exactly what was at stake. Over the following months, while Savannah paraded around town, rubbing her growing belly and continuing to paint me as the villain to anyone who would listen, I played the part of the defeated mother-in-law. I stayed away from their house. I smiled politely at the rare family dinners, holding my tongue, while Hunter and Claire made their snide comments. I absorbed their disrespect like a sponge, because behind the scenes, I was quietly building an ironclad fortress of evidence. Mr. Wallace was worth every single penny. He discreetly pulled public financial records revealing the massive liens against Hunter's contracting business. He tracked the offshore routing numbers Savannah used to funnel Jamal's hard-earned money into Hunter's failing accounts. He secured high-resolution photographs of Savannah meeting secretly with Preston outside a secluded country club, confirming their ongoing illicit connection. I compiled every bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, and every photograph into a thick, heavy binder hidden safely in my bedroom. But I knew financial fraud would not be enough to break the powerful spell Savannah had over my son. Jamal was an honorable man. He would try to forgive the theft if he believed the child she carried was his own flesh and blood. I needed undeniable, absolute proof that the baby was not a product of their marriage. I needed a DNA test, and I needed it before the child was born. Mr. Wallace and I devised a careful covert plan to secure a DNA sample from Preston. We tracked Preston's daily routine, noting that he visited a specific upscale coffee shop every morning after his gym workout. For 3 days, I sat in my parked car across the street, watching Preston order his iced black coffee, drink it on the patio, and toss the plastic cup into the corner trash can before getting into his sports car. On the 4th day, I made my move. As soon as Preston drove away, I walked briskly over to the trash receptacle. My heart was racing as I put on a pair of clear plastic gloves. I reached into the bin and retrieved the exact cup his lips had just touched. I carefully sealed the cup inside a sterile evidence bag Mr. Wallace had provided. I felt like a criminal, but I knew I was a mother fighting for her son's life. I sent the secured sample, along with a sample I had quietly retrieved from Jamal's old hairbrush, directly to a highly accredited private genetics laboratory. The waiting period was absolute torture. I spent those weeks grading my old educational materials, tending to my garden, and enduring the agonizing silence from my son, who was increasingly isolated by his toxic wife. Savannah was busy planning lavish baby showers, with my money confident that her sinister web was perfectly spun. I simply watched the calendar, knowing the storm was coming. When the heavy, certified envelope from the genetics laboratory finally arrived in my mailbox, I carried it to my kitchen table with trembling hands. I tore open the seal and pulled out the crisp white paper. I scanned the dense medical jargon until my eyes landed on the final, conclusive paragraph. The probability of paternity was 0%. The unborn child shared absolutely no genetic markers with Jamal. The science was clear, definitive, and legally binding. Savannah's entire life was built on a monumental, disgusting lie. I took a deep, steadying breath and placed the DNA results into the thick binder alongside the photographs and the financial records. The trap was fully set. I had gathered all my weapons in the dark. Now it was time to step into the light and deliver the reckoning my son so desperately needed. The birth of the baby was supposed to be a joyous occasion, the crowning moment of my life as a grandmother. Instead, it became the exact moment Savannah decided she was completely untouchable. She had delivered a healthy baby boy, and in her mind, that child was the unbreakable padlock on my son's bank accounts. When I visited them a week after they returned from the hospital, the atmosphere in that massive house was suffocating. Savannah was perched on the living room sofa like a reigning queen, surrounded by expensive floral arrangements and catered meals that Hunter and Claire had ordered using Jamal's credit cards. Jamal was at the hospital pulling yet another double shift to cover the astronomical medical bills and the luxury postpartum care Savannah demanded. I had come simply to bring some homemade soup and fold some laundry, wanting to ease my son's burden. I was quietly folding baby blankets in the nursery when Savannah walked in. There was no one else on that floor of the house. She looked at me with a cold, triumphant smirk that I will never forget. She did not say a single word to me. Instead, she took a deep breath, grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the changing table and hurled it violently against the hardwood floor. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces with a deafening crash. Before I could even process what was happening, Savannah dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, and began to scream hysterically. She wailed as if she were being attacked, hyperventilating and crying out for help. I stood there absolutely paralyzed by the sheer malice of her performance. Within seconds, heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. Hunter and Claire burst into the nursery, rushing to Savannah's side. It was a perfectly choreographed ambush. Claire immediately began rubbing Savannah's back, glaring at me with manufactured disgust, while Hunter pulled out his phone and called Jamal, telling him he needed to rush home because his mother had just violently attacked his postpartum wife. When Jamal sprinted through the front door 20 minutes later, still wearing his hospital scrubs, the scene had been set flawlessly. Savannah was trembling in his arms, weeping crocodile tears, whispering that I had screamed at her, threatened to take her baby away, and smashed the vase in a fit of jealous rage. Hunter stood tall, puffing out his chest, telling my son that I was unhinged and dangerously aggressive. Claire leaned in, her voice dripping with that quiet, condescending authority she loved to use, telling Jamal that Savannah was suffering from severe postpartum vulnerability and that my toxic, hostile presence was pushing her toward a complete mental breakdown. I looked at my beautiful, brilliant boy, praying he would see the truth. I prayed he would remember the mother who worked 3 jobs to buy his first stethoscope, the woman who had never raised her voice in violence a single day in her life. But Jamal was utterly exhausted, broken down by sleepless nights and the relentless psychological warfare his wife had waged against him. He looked at me, and his eyes were completely hollow. He told me that Savannah's mental health had to come first. He said he could not risk his wife or his newborn son being exposed to my hostility. And then he delivered the final devastating blow. He told me they were hosting a lavish christening and welcome party for the baby at the country club that weekend. A party I knew was costing tens of thousands of dollars of his hard-earned money. With a trembling voice, he asked me not to attend. He banned me from celebrating the birth of my own grandchild, telling me that my presence would only cause more trauma for Savannah. Hunter smirked at me from across the room, crossing his arms in victory. Claire gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity, shaking her head as if I were a wild animal that needed to be put down. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had finally severed the deep, sacred bond between a mother and her son, securing their permanent access to his wealth. I stood in the center of that beautiful nursery, surrounded by the shattered crystal that Savannah had weaponized against me. I felt a profound, burning agony in the very center of my chest, a physical pain that only a mother who has just been rejected by her child can truly understand. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to demand that he look at the facts, look at my history, and see the venomous snake he had invited into his home. But looking at Jamal's slumped shoulders and his desperate bloodshot eyes, I realized that arguing would only validate their vicious narrative. If I raised my voice to defend myself, Claire would immediately brand me as the angry, aggressive black woman she desperately wanted me to be. If I cried, Savannah would claim I was emotionally manipulating my son. I was trapped in a perfectly designed snare, completely surrounded by people who viewed my son as nothing more than a human ATM. Every dollar I had sacrificed, every retirement account I had drained to buy them this very house, was being used to fund my own execution from his life. I did not scream. I did not cry in front of them. I looked my son directly in the eyes, swallowed every ounce of my pride, and gave them exactly what they wanted to see. I lowered my head, feigned absolute defeat, and told Jamal that I understood. I whispered that I would stay away, that I only wanted peace for his new family. And I slowly walked out of the house. I could feel Savannah's triumphant gaze burning into my back as I walked down the driveway. They truly believed I was just a sad, broken old woman walking away into the shadows to die of a broken heart. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply retreating to arm the explosive trap they had just happily walked right into. The very next morning, the mail carrier dropped a heavy, certified envelope into my mailbox. I carried it into my quiet kitchen, the house feeling incredibly still compared to the chaos of the day before. I sat at the same small table where I had spent decades grading high school history papers, took a deep breath, and tore open the seal. It was the document I had been waiting for. The official results from the highly accredited private genetics laboratory. I scanned past the complex medical jargon and the scientific disclaimers until my eyes locked onto the final, undeniable conclusion printed in bold black ink. The probability of paternity was 0%. The child Savannah had just given birth to the child she was using to manipulate my son and drain his trust fund, shared absolutely no genetic markers with Jamal. The baby belonged to Preston. Her entire marriage, her entire lifestyle, and the vicious psychological warfare she had waged against me were all built on a massive, disgusting lie. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, washing away all the residual pain and heartbreak from the day before. I picked up the phone and called my attorney, a ruthless, brilliant man who had helped me navigate the school district's legal battles for years. I drove straight to his downtown office, carrying my thick, heavy binder of evidence. When I laid everything out on his polished mahogany desk, even he was stunned by the sheer magnitude of the deception. I showed him the certified DNA results. The time-stamped photographs of Savannah sneaking into hotels with Preston and the mountain of financial records my private investigator had uncovered. I showed him the offshore routing numbers, the massive wire transfers Savannah had secretly made to bail out Hunter's failing contracting business, and the clear evidence that they were embezzling Jamal's hard-earned medical salary. We spent the next 4 hours preparing a foolproof, devastating dossier. My attorney drafted a comprehensive lawsuit against Hunter and Savannah for embezzlement, fraud, and emotional distress. We compiled the financial evidence into neat, undeniable spreadsheets that clearly traced every single stolen dollar directly back to Hunter's bank accounts. We placed the original certified DNA test results right at the very front of the binder. There was no room for Savannah to gaslight her way out of this. There was no room for Claire to whisper away the facts. The trap was perfectly constructed, completely legal, and ready to be sprung. I knew Savannah was expecting to reign supreme at the country club that weekend. She had spent a fortune of my son's money renting out the grand ballroom, hiring expensive caterers, and inviting everyone she knew to celebrate her fake, perfect life. She expected to sit on a throne of lies, sipping champagne, while my son footed the bill, completely secure in the knowledge that she had successfully banished me forever. But I was not a defeated victim. I was a mother fiercely protecting her cub, and I was about to walk right into her lavish party and burn her entire kingdom to the ground. I instructed my attorney to have the local authorities and my private investigator on standby outside the country club. I wanted everything handled with absolute precision. Savannah and Hunter had relied on my love for Jamal to keep me silent, assuming I would never cause a public scandal because I would be too afraid of embarrassing my son. But they severely underestimated a mother's willingness to endure temporary discomfort for the sake of her child's permanent freedom. Jamal was going to hurt, the truth was going to break his heart, but it was the only way to save his future. As I drove back to my house that evening, I laid out my best tailored suit. I polished the shoes I used to wear when facing down difficult school board meetings. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and saw a woman who had survived the loss of her husband, the struggles of single motherhood, and the brutal demands of a 35-year career in education. Savannah thought she had buried me under her lies, but she did not realize I was a seed. I turned off my kitchen lights, set my alarm for the morning of the country club party, and slept with the profound, undisturbed peace of a woman who knows that absolute justice is only a few hours away. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterclass in excessive suburban vanity. As I stepped through the heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom, the sheer financial waste of the event hit me instantly. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of round tables draped in pristine white linen. A massive archway, made entirely of imported blue and white roses, framed a velvet throne where Savannah sat holding court like a reigning queen. She wore a custom silk gown that draped perfectly over her newly postpartum figure, a glass of sparkling cider in her manicured hand. Hunter and Claire stood on either side of her sipping vintage champagne and laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. They looked incredibly comfortable, reveling in the absolute peak of their parasitic success. They were playing the roles of the perfect wealthy family to an audience of highly influential guests. Then I saw my son. Jamal stood off to the side, completely alienated from the center of attention. He looked like a ghost, haunting his own life. The dark circles under his eyes were deeper than ever, his posture slumped beneath the crushing weight of exhaustion and the endless demands placed upon him. He was footing the bill for this entire lavish spectacle, yet he looked like a stranger in the room. Seeing my brilliant, hard-working boy reduced to a mere financial prop fueled the righteous fire burning in my chest. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored emerald green suit, gripped the heavy leather binder in my right hand, and walked forward. I channeled every ounce of authority I had cultivated over 35 years of commanding crowded high school auditoriums, breaking up hallway fights, and staring down board members. I did not sneak in. I walked with the heavy, deliberate cadence of a woman who owned the ground she stepped on. My presence registered in ripples. First, the guests near the entrance stopped talking. Then the silence spread across the room like a cold wave overtaking the soft jazz playing in the background. The music abruptly halted. Savannah looked up, and the smug, victorious smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. Hunter was the first to react. He set his champagne glass down with a sharp clink and marched directly toward me, his face turning an angry, blotchy red. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, just as he had always done with his passive-aggressive jokes at my dining table. "You have some serious nerve showing up here," he sneered, pointing a finger in my face. "Savannah made it perfectly clear you are not welcome. Turn around and leave before I have security throw you out." I did not stop walking. I did not flinch. I simply turned my head, locked eyes with him, and delivered a look so utterly devoid of fear that he actually paused. I spoke in a calm, booming voice that echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling, carrying to every single corner of the silent ballroom. "You do not give orders to me, Hunter. In fact, you should be figuring out how to call a very good defense attorney." I walked right past him, leaving him standing there in stunned silence, and made a straight line toward Jamal. My son looked at me with wide, confused eyes, torn between the narrative he had been fed and the undeniable reality of his mother standing before him. I stopped right in front of him, my heart aching at the sight of his tired face, and handed him the thick, heavy binder. "Jamal," I said, my voice steady, projecting absolute clarity, "I am sorry to ruin this party. I am sorry for the pain you are about to feel. But I will not stand by and let these people destroy your life for one more second. Open the binder." Savannah scrambled out of her velvet chair, stumbling over the hem of her expensive gown. "Jamal, do not listen to her. She is crazy. She is trying to ruin our family because she is jealous. Get her out of here." Claire rushed forward, her voice pitching into that familiar, shrill tone of manufactured victimhood. "This is exactly what we warned you about, Jamal. She is unhinged. She is having a psychotic break right in front of all these people." I ignored their shrieking completely. I kept my eyes locked on my son. "Go to the second tab, Jamal. Look at the bank statements. Look at the offshore routing numbers." Jamal opened the binder. His medical training had made him a man of science and facts, a man who understood data. His eyes scanned the highlighted spreadsheets and the stamped bank records. The entire room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the paper as he turned the pages. "For the past 8 months, I announced to the room your wife and her brother have been systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars out of your joint accounts. Those emergency home repairs and exorbitant nursery expenses were completely fabricated. Every single dime was wire transferred directly into Hunter's failing contracting business to cover his massive gambling debts and keep his bankrupt company afloat." Hunter lunged forward, yelling that I was a lying, bitter old woman, but the crowd of guests shrank back from him. The evidence was right there in Jamal's hands. Jamal's face turned ashen as he traced the exact dates and the exact amounts of his stolen wages. He looked up at Savannah, his voice barely a whisper. "You sent Hunter $80,000. You told me that money went into a high-yield savings account for the baby." Savannah burst into theatrical tears, clutching her chest, just as she had done in the nursery. "She is forging those documents, Jamal. She hates me. She fabricated all of this to frame my brother. Please, you have to protect me from her. She was good. She really was. But I had saved the absolute worst for last." "Turn to the very first page, Jamal," I commanded, my voice slicing right through Savannah's fake sobbing. Jamal flipped the heavy pages back to the front. He stared at the crisp white paper from the certified private genetics laboratory. I watched his eyes track across the medical terminology, moving down to the bold black ink at the bottom of the page. The silence in the ballroom stretched into an agonizing eternity. I looked directly at Savannah, whose face had gone completely grey. "That is a court-admissible DNA test, Savannah. It proves with absolute scientific certainty that the child you just gave birth to shares 0% of his genetic markers with my son. The baby belongs to Preston, the man you have been meeting secretly at the downtown hotel for the last 10 months. Photographs of those little hotel visits are in tab 4, by the way." The gasp that rippled through the country club was deafening. The wealthy guests, Savannah's friends and the country club staff, stared at her in utter horror. The facade crumbled instantly. The sweet, supportive wife vanished, leaving behind a terrified, cornered woman whose entire fraudulent kingdom had just been annihilated in front of an audience. Claire dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Hunter, realizing the sheer magnitude of what had just been exposed, went completely pale. The arrogant, passive-aggressive bully was suddenly calculating his own survival. He looked at the binder. looked at the furious, devastated face of my son, and made a silent decision. He slowly backed away from Savannah, turning on his heel to make a swift break for the side exit of the ballroom. He pushed hard on the heavy mahogany doors, desperate to escape into the parking lot. But as the doors swung open, he was violently pushed back inside. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Wallace, my private investigator, flanked by 3 uniformed police officers and a stern-looking detective. Hunter tried to stammer an excuse, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. But the detective stepped forward with a pair of steel handcuffs. "You are not going anywhere, sir," the detective stated plainly, turning him around and securing his wrists behind his back. "We have a mountain of evidence regarding massive financial fraud and embezzlement." Savannah screamed a horrible guttural sound as she watched her brother being detained. She reached out for Jamal, crying real tears, now begging him to listen to her, pleading that it was a mistake. But Jamal stepped back, holding the binder against his chest as if it were a shield. The man who had been exhausted, manipulated, and isolated for over a year finally saw the absolute truth. He looked at his wife with a mixture of profound disgust and crushing heartbreak. "Do not touch me," Jamal said, his voice cold and terrifyingly calm. "Do not ever speak to me again." He walked right past her, ignoring her wailing, and came to stand by my side. I reached out and took his arm, feeling him tremble with the shock of the revelation. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the people who had judged me, the people who had believed Savannah's venomous lies. I held my head high, projecting the unyielding strength of a mother who had successfully defended her blood. The wicked mother-in-law had just saved her son's life, and I was taking my boy home. The aftermath of that spectacular day at the country club was a chaotic storm of legal proceedings and shattered illusions, but it was an absolutely necessary storm to cleanse my son's entire life. Over the next 6 months, the justice system methodically dismantled the fraudulent empire Savannah and her brother had attempted to build on Jamal's back. Because my attorney and I had compiled such an airtight mountain of financial evidence, the divorce proceedings were swift and merciless. Savannah was entirely stripped of any claim to the marital assets. The massive suburban estate I had funded was immediately put on the market, and the proceeds were rightfully returned directly to my retirement accounts. Savannah was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment, now facing severe criminal charges for the systematic financial fraud she had committed against her own husband. Her brother Hunter fared even worse. The authorities seized every single remaining asset from his failing contracting business. The auditors traced the embezzled funds, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had knowingly received stolen money to cover his massive gambling debts. He is currently awaiting trial and is facing significant jail time for his massive crimes. Claire quietly filed for divorce and moved back to her hometown, desperately trying to escape the heavy public disgrace her husband had brought upon their name. As for Jamal, his healing process was an incredibly painful journey. Watching the woman he loved turn out to be a calculated predator completely broke his spirit. He spent the first few months after the revelation sitting in my modest living room, processing the deep trauma of her deception. But pain is often the greatest teacher we will ever have. One quiet Sunday morning, while I was making him a warm breakfast, Jamal finally broke down and wept deeply in my arms. He apologized to me with a profound sincerity that washed away every single tear I had shed over the past 2 agonizing years. He told me he finally understood the immense, painful sacrifice I had made. He realized that I had willingly worn the ugly label of the wicked, toxic mother-in-law, just so I could stay close enough to uncover the dark truth and completely save his future. He begged for my forgiveness, for blinding himself to their cruel manipulation, and for ever doubting the fierce, unconditional love of the woman who had sacrificed her entire youth for his success. I held my beautiful boy tight and told him that a mother never needs an apology for protecting her child from evil. Today, our relationship is stronger and far more honest than it has ever been. Jamal moved into a beautiful modern apartment in the city, focusing entirely on his medical career and finding true peace in his newfound independence. We share Sunday dinners every single week without fail, and there are no more cold whispers or cruel microaggressions allowed at my table. There is just joy, warmth, and the unbreakable sacred bond between a mother and her son. When I sit on my porch, now sipping my coffee, I feel a profound, absolute peace. The brutal storm has completely passed and my family is entirely safe. I look back on those dark, isolated months, and I do not regret a single moment of my silent endurance. I used the skills I developed over 35 years as a high school principal to investigate, document, and execute a flawless plan to protect my own flesh and blood. I reclaimed my peace, my money, and my own beautiful, precious son I raised. Sometimes letting them paint you as the villain is the only way to sit quietly in the shadows and find the truth. Never mistake the silence of a mother for weakness. We carry the heavy burdens, so our children do not have to. We endure the cruelest insults and the darkest lies, because our fierce love is far stronger than any temporary humiliation. We will always do whatever it takes to protect our children from those wicked predators who seek to absolutely destroy them. I am incredibly grateful to share this victorious moment of pure redemption and absolute freedom with every one of you today. I hope my journey reminds you of your own inner power. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to play the bad guy to protect someone you love? Let me know in the comments below. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far our family reaches. Thank you for listening to my truth today. You are never completely alone in your struggles. Until next time, stay strong and trust your intuition.